Since ancient times, there has been a question that arouses curiosity, fear, and fascination. What happened to the angels who rebelled against God? Many people know stories about fallen angels, giants, and an ancient corruption that took over the earth before the flood. But few know that one of the most detailed accounts of this event is not in the traditional books of the Bible. This account appears in the Book of Enoch, an ancient and mysterious text that describes stunning events involving celestial beings who defied divine order. According to this book, a group of angels descended to earth, made forbidden alliances with humans, and revealed knowledge that should never have been shared. But the story doesn't end there. The Book of Enoch also describes the judgment and final fate of these rebellious angels, a fate marked by punishment, imprisonment, and the wait for an even greater judgment. In this video, we will explore what this ancient book reveals about who these angels were, what they did on earth, and what purpose was reserved for them. Prepare to delve into one of the most mysterious and debated stories in ancient lore. Throughout history, many religious traditions talk about angels who rebelled against God. These stories appear in ancient texts, Jewish traditions, and interpretations of biblical passages. But there is a specific book that delves into this topic in a surprising way, the Book of Enoch. This ancient text describes a moment when certain angels, known as watchers, made a decision that would change the destiny of humanity. Instead of remaining faithful to the mission they were given, they chose to come down to earth and directly interfere in human life. According to the account, these angels not only mingled with humans, but also revealed forbidden knowledge, teachings about weapons, magic, astrology, and other secrets that, according to the book, accelerated the corruption of the world. Over time, these actions would have contributed to increased violence and disorder on Earth. This narrative raises several questions that intrigue scholars and curious people to this day. Who were these angels really? Why did they decide to defy divine order? And most importantly, what was their fate after this rebellion? The Book of Enoch states that the answer to these questions involves severe judgment and punishment beyond human time. And that is exactly what we will explore throughout this video. What happened to these rebellious angels? And what was the end reserved for them according to this ancient text? This story is not just a story about the past. For many scholars, it also works as a warning about power, disobedience, and the consequences of exceeding limits established by the divine. And it is precisely this mystery that makes the Book of Enoch continue to arouse so much curiosity to this day. To understand the fate of the rebellious angels, we first need to know the Book of Enoch. This is one of the most mysterious ancient texts linked to Jewish traditions and the origins of religious thought about angels, heaven, and divine judgment. The book is attributed to Enoch, a character briefly mentioned in the Bible in the book of Genesis. He is described as the great-grandfather of Noah and someone who walked with God. This small description aroused great curiosity throughout history, and many ancient texts began to circulate, stating that Enoch had received divine visions and revelations about the heavens and the destiny of the world. The so-called Book of Enoch, or West Enoch, is a collection of ancient writings that were probably produced between about 300 BC and 100 BC. These texts have been preserved mainly in the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, where the book is still considered part of the sacred scriptures. What makes this book so special is the type of content it presents. Unlike many traditional religious texts, the Book of Enoch describes in detail the fall of the watcher angels. The emergence of the giants called Nephilim. Enoch's travels through the heavens and places of judgment revelations about the end times. For centuries, this book circulated widely among ancient Jewish communities. In fact, some scholars believe that certain ideas present in the Book of Enoch influenced religious thoughts that appeared later in other traditions. For a long time, the text was lost to much of the world, until manuscripts related to it were also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century, showing that these stories had been known for more than 2,000 years. But among all the themes covered in this book, one of the most impressive is precisely the story of the angels who rebelled against God and the judgment they received. And that's exactly where one of the most dramatic parts of this ancient story begins. In the Book of Enoch, the angels who rebelled against God are called watchers. This name comes from the idea that they were celestial beings assigned to observe and monitor the development of humanity on earth. Its original mission was not to govern humans, nor directly interfere in their lives, but rather to monitor and carry out divine orders. According to the report, there was a group of around 200 of these angels who observed the world from above. Among them were leaders, and the chief one was called Semjaza, or Shemyaza. It was under his leadership that these angels began to desire something that was not allowed to them: to live among humans. The Book of Enoch describes that, upon seeing the women of earth, the watchers began to feel desire for them. That desire ultimately led to the decision that would change everything. They took a collective oath on Mount Hermon, promising that everyone would participate in the rebellion so that no one would go back alone. This moment is considered, in the text, the beginning of the fall of the Watchers. After this oath, they descended to earth and began to act in ways that completely exceeded the limits of the mission they had been given. In addition to having relationships with human women, they also began to teach secret knowledge that, according to the book, should remain hidden from humanity. Some of these teachings included warfare and weapons manufacturing techniques, practices of magic and sorcery, astrology, and star-reading, use of metals and adornments that would encourage vanity. For the author of the Book of Enoch, these revelations did not bring progress, but rather corruption and imbalance in the human world. What should have remained under divine control ended up being used in a destructive way. And it was exactly from this forbidden union between angels and humans that a new generation of beings emerged, the giants known as Nephilim, whose existence would mark the next chapter of this story. After taking the oath on Mount Hermon, the Watchers finally descended to earth, beginning one of the most dramatic events described in the Book of Enoch. This moment marks the point at which their disobedience stops being just an intention and turns into a direct rebellion against divine order. According to the report, these angels began to live among humans and began to have relationships with women on earth, something that should never have happened. They took these women as wives and began to have children with them, completely breaking the boundaries between the heavenly world and the human world. But the rebellion did not stop there. The Watchers also began teaching humans secret and forbidden knowledge. Each of them brought different teachings that, according to the book, ended up contributing to the corruption of humanity. Among these teachings were Azazel taught humans how to make swords, shields, and other weapons of war. Other angels taught magic, spells, and sorcery. Some revealed secrets of astrology and the movement of the stars. They also taught techniques for ornamentation, makeup, and the use of precious metals. According to the Book of Enoch, these revelations caused the world to become increasingly violent and corrupt. Humanity began to use this knowledge to dominate, war, and exploit each other. The text describes that the earth began to be filled with violence, injustice, and destruction, something that had never happened on that scale. Creation, which should live in balance, began to collapse, and it was precisely from this forbidden union between the Watchers and human women that gigantic and powerful beings were born, the Nephilim. Their arrival would take the world's chaos to an even greater level, setting the stage for a judgment that was about to take place. As a consequence of the forbidden union between the Watchers and human women, something emerged that would completely change the balance of the earth, the Nephilim. In the Book of Enoch, they are described as powerful giants, unlike any ordinary human being. These beings were born with extraordinary strength and size. The text describes that they grew quickly and began to dominate everything around them. At first, they consumed resources produced by humans, but over time their hunger and violence began to become uncontrollable. According to the report, the Nephilim began to devour everything they found: crops, animals, and even human beings themselves. The earth, which was once inhabited by ordinary human communities, became marked by fear, destruction, and suffering. In addition to physical strength, these giants also inherited knowledge and skills from the Watchers that made them even more dangerous. As a result, they began to spread violence and chaos everywhere. The Book of Enoch describes that the situation became so serious that the world began to enter an moral and spiritual collapse. Violence multiplied, injustice spread, and humanity began to live in a constant state of conflict. According to the text, the earth itself began to cry out to the heavens because of the destruction and suffering caused by the giants and angels who had rebelled. This cry reached God, and it was at that moment that divine judgment began to prepare. The existence of the Nephilim not only represented a threat to humanity, but also symbolized the direct result of the breaking of the laws established between heaven and earth. And this violation would have consequences that would change the fate of everyone involved. With the presence of the Nephilim and the influence of the Watchers, the world began to descend into a period of unprecedented corruption and violence. According to the Book of Enoch, what began with the disobedience of a few angels quickly spread throughout humanity. The giants began to dominate the earth with their strength. Human cities and peoples had no way to resist them. The text describes that the Nephilim not only destroyed everything around them, but also spread fear and suffering among men. Violence became commonplace, and the order of the world began to break down. At the same time, the forbidden teachings given by the Watchers continued to spread among humans. Knowledge about war, sorcery, and manipulation of nature began to be used in an increasingly destructive way. For the author of the Book of Enoch, this represented a profound corruption of creation. As time passed, the situation became so serious that, according to the report, the earth itself began to cry out for justice. Human suffering, the destruction of nature, and the dominance of giants reached the heavens. At this point in the narrative, the book describes that the archangels observed what was happening in the world. Miguel, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel would have seen the corruption that took over the earth and took this cry before God. It was then that a divine decision began to be made. The chaos caused by the rebellious angels and the Nephilim could not continue. A judgment was about to take place, and it would not only affect the giants or the Watchers, but also the corrupted world itself. This moment sets the stage for one of the best-known events in ancient tradition, the Great Flood, which would be sent to purify the earth and put an end to the chaos that had spread throughout creation. Faced with all the corruption that had taken over the earth, the Book of Enoch describes that God decided to act. The suffering of humanity, the violence caused by the Nephilim, and the rebellion of the Watchers could not continue without consequences. According to the account, God summoned 4 great archangels to execute judgment and restore order to creation. These archangels were Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, each receiving a specific mission to deal with the chaos that had spread across the world. Raphael received the mission of dealing with one of the main people responsible for corruption, Azazel. He must capture this rebellious angel and imprison him in a deep, deserted place where he would remain imprisoned until the day of final judgment. Gabriel was ordered to face the Nephilim, the giants that were devastating the earth. According to the Book of Enoch, he was tasked with provoking conflicts between them, causing them to destroy each other. Michael, one of the best-known archangels, was tasked with punishing the leaders of the Watchers, including Semjaza, the leader of the rebellion. They were to be captured and imprisoned in deep abysses until the moment of final judgment. Uriel received a different mission, to warn Noah about what was about to happen. He was to warn him about the great flood that would come to purify the earth and put an end to the corruption that had spread throughout the world. This moment marks a crucial point in the narrative of the Book of Enoch. After all the chaos caused by the rebellion of the angels and the existence of the giants, the divine judgment finally begins to be carried out. But the Watchers' punishment was not yet over. The final fate of these rebellious angels would be even more severe, something that the Book of Enoch impressively describes in the next events. After divine judgment was decreed, the direct punishment of the Watchers, the angels who had rebelled, began. The Book of Enoch describes that these beings, who previously possessed great power and celestial position, began to face the consequences of their own choices. According to the account, the archangels captured the leaders of the rebellion and chained them in deep places on earth, described as dark and isolated abysses. These places are presented as spiritual prisons, where the Watchers would be kept under surveillance until the moment of final judgment. The text states that Semjaza and the other leaders of the vigilantes were tied up and thrown into deep caves covered by rocks, where they would remain trapped for thousands of years. There they would be forced to wait for the day when everyone would be brought before God to face definitive judgment. Azazel, one of the angels most associated with the corruption of humanity, received an even more specific punishment. According to the Book of Enoch, he was trapped in a desert called Dudael, where he was thrown into a deep hole filled with sharp rocks and covered in darkness. In addition to the prison, the text describes that the Watchers were forced to witness the destruction of their own children, the giant Nephilim. This detail makes the punishment even heavier, as they would see the direct consequences of what they had caused on earth. From that moment on, the rebellious angels stopped being powerful observers and became prisoners awaiting an even harsher fate. The Book of Enoch states that they would remain imprisoned until the day they were brought to the final judgment, where they would face eternal punishment. But the end of this story doesn't just end with imprisonment. The text also talks about the final destiny of these angels in the great judgment that is yet to come, something that makes this narrative even more impressive. Although the Watchers were imprisoned in the depths of the earth, the Book of Enoch states that this is not their final punishment. Imprisonment in deep caves would only be a wait for the great judgment day, when all who rebelled against the divine order would finally be judged. According to the text, these angels would remain chained for many generations, awaiting the moment when they would be taken before God to answer for everything they had done. Disobedience, the corruption of humanity, and the breaking of the laws established between heaven and earth. When that day comes, the Book of Enoch describes that the Watchers will be led to the final judgment, where they will receive a definitive punishment. The text talks about a place of fire and torment, prepared for those who defied the divine order and caused destruction in creation. Furthermore, the book states that the spirits of the giants, the Nephilim who died, would become evil spirits that would continue to roam the earth, causing problems for humanity. The angels who originated all this would remain imprisoned until they faced their final destiny. This part of the narrative reinforces a central idea present in the Book of Enoch. No rebellion against the divine order would go without consequence. Even celestial beings, who once had power and high position, would not escape judgment. Thus, the final destiny of the rebellious angels would not just be temporary imprisonment, but rather eternal damnation, as a direct result of having exceeded the limits established between heaven and earth. And it is precisely this message of justice and consequence that leads to the last reflection of this story. What this ancient story can mean for us today. Even though it is an extremely old text, the story of the rebellious angels in the Book of Enoch continues to arouse interest to this day. This happens because the story is not just a narrative about celestial beings and giants, but also a reflection on power, responsibility, and the consequences of disobedience. In the book, the Watchers were beings who possessed great knowledge and authority. However, by exceeding the limits established for them, they ended up bringing corruption, violence, and suffering to the world. History shows that even those who held high positions could fall when they chose to follow their own desires rather than divine order. For many scholars, this account also tries to explain why the ancient world would have descended into so much violence before the flood. The narrative presents the idea that certain knowledge, when used incorrectly, can cause destruction instead of progress. Additionally, the Book of Enoch introduces concepts that influenced several later religious traditions, such as the existence of fallen angels, the final judgment, and the idea that spiritual forces can influence the human world. Regardless of how each person interprets this text as literal history, ancient tradition, or spiritual symbol, the fact is that this narrative remains one of the most mysterious and debated in ancient religious literature. And perhaps the most intriguing question remains: are these stories just ancient myths, or are they echoes of something that, according to these texts, really happened in the distant past? What if some of the angels mentioned in the ancient scriptures not only fell, but were also judged, chained, and condemned to a terrible fate that is still ongoing to this day? This is one of the most intriguing questions as we explore one of the most mysterious texts ever written, the Book of Enoch. But after all, what does the Book of Enoch say about the end of the rebellious angels? Does this ancient book reveal details that have never been fully explained in traditional scriptures? For centuries, scholars, theologians, and the curious have wondered about the story of the fallen angels, the Watchers, and the giants called Nephilim. Many only know small references scattered in ancient texts, but few know that there is an ancient document that describes this story in much more depth. This document is precisely the Book of Enoch, a text that continues to be surrounded by mystery and debate to this day. When we begin to explore what this book tells, we find a surprising narrative. According to the text, there was a group of angels known as Watchers, celestial beings whose mission was to observe humanity. They shouldn't directly interfere in the destiny of humans, but something happened that completely changed that order. These angels, according to the account, descended to earth and engaged with the human world in a way that should never have happened. From that moment on, the story takes an impressive turn. The Book of Enoch describes that these angels not only approached humans, but also began to reveal secret knowledge that should have remained hidden. Among these teachings were war techniques, secrets about metals, magic, astrology, and various other knowledge considered forbidden. For the author of the text, these revelations did not bring evolution to humanity, but rather corruption and chaos. And it is exactly at this point that the narrative begins to raise an even more disturbing question. What happened to these angels after they rebelled against divine order? Unlike many simplified stories about fallen angels, the Book of Enoch states that their rebellion had extremely severe consequences. The text talks about spiritual prisons, deep abysses, and a judgment that was yet to come. This story doesn't just involve angels. According to the story, from this forbidden union between celestial beings and humans, giant creatures called Nephilim emerged. These giants would have spread violence and destruction across the earth, contributing to a period of great corruption that, according to the book, ended up leading to divine judgment and the events that preceded the Great Flood. Because of this, many researchers consider the Book of Enoch to be one of the most important texts for understanding the origin of the idea of rebellious angels and spiritual judgment. Even though it is not present in most modern versions of the Bible, this book influenced several ancient traditions and continues to be studied today. But what really makes this story so fascinating is that the Book of Enoch doesn't just talk about the fall of these angels. He also describes their fate, the punishments imposed, and what would be in store for these beings in the future. And it is precisely here that the story begins to become even more surprising, because according to this ancient text, the judgment of the rebellious angels did not end at that moment. It just began. Before we continue revealing what the Book of Enoch says about the final fate of the rebellious angels, let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever heard of this story before? Many people only know snippets about fallen angels, but few truly understand what this ancient text describes in detail. And understanding this content is important because it helps you better understand several ideas that appear in ancient traditions about angels, divine judgment, and the mystery of the Nephilim. Now, I want to know your opinion. Do you believe the Book of Enoch reveals something that has been left out of other ancient texts? Or do you think these stories are just interpretations that have emerged over time? Write here in the comments, because your participation helps a lot to enrich the discussion and makes this space even more interesting for those who like these themes full of mystery. And if you like content like this, which explores biblical mysteries, ancient stories, and little-known revelations, take the opportunity to leave a like on the video. It may seem simple, but a like really helps the video reach more people who are also interested in these subjects. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos where we will continue exploring fascinating stories like this, revealing details that often go unnoticed when we only read the best-known versions of these ancient stories. Now that you know a little about the mystery behind this text and the importance of what we are going to analyze here, the time has come to dive deeper into this story. Because to understand the end of the rebellious angels according to the Book of Enoch, we first need to understand exactly what were these beings known as Watchers and what really happened when they decided to defy divine order. Now that we understand the context and why the Book of Enoch arouses so much curiosity when it comes to rebellious angels, fallen angels, and mysteries of ancient scriptures, we need to go a little further into the story. Because, according to this ancient text, it all started with a specific group of celestial beings known as Watchers. These angels had a very clear function within the divine order: to observe humanity and monitor the development of the human world. They were not created to rule men, nor to live among them. The mission was simply to watch, learn, and fulfill what had been determined in the heavens. But at a certain point, something changed. The Book of Enoch describes that these angels began to observe humanity in a different way. As they observed Earth, they began to notice something that caught their attention: human women. The text describes that the beauty of women awakened an unexpected desire in these celestial beings. And it was precisely this desire that began one of the most dangerous decisions ever made by this group of angels. Among the Watchers there were leaders, and the chief of them was called Semjaza. According to the report, he was the one who noticed that many of the angels were thinking the same thing. However, there was also a fear among them. Coming down to earth and breaking the divine order was something extremely serious. Some feared that if just one person made this decision, they would end up being punished alone. Then Semjaza proposed something that would completely change the course of this story. He suggested that everyone take a collective oath. This oath would guarantee that none of them would back down. If everyone participated in the decision, everyone would assume the same risk. Thus, according to the Book of Enoch, about 200 watchers made a pact among themselves. They gathered at a specific place on earth, a location that is also mentioned in the text, Mount Hermon. There, in that place, they sealed the oath that would mark the beginning of the rebellion. After this pact, the watchers finally descended to earth, and it was at that moment that what should have been just observation turned into direct interference in the human world. These angels began to live among people and began to have relationships with human women. According to the account in the Book of Enoch, they took these women as wives, something that represented a complete breaking of the separation between the heavenly world and the human world. But that was not the only consequence of this decision. The watchers also began to share knowledge that, according to the text, should remain hidden from humanity. Each of them revealed certain teachings. One of the most mentioned names in this part of the story is Azazel, who would have taught humans how to make weapons, swords, and shields. Other angels taught magic, incantations, astrology, and secrets related to the movement of the stars. At first glance, these teachings might seem like just knowledge, but the Book of Enoch describes that these secrets began to bring about profound changes in human behavior. The world began to experience something that previously did not exist on a large scale: organized violence, wars, and increasingly intense disputes. As time passed, these influences began to transform the earth. Humanity, which previously lived in a simpler way, began to use this knowledge to dominate each other. Weapons began to appear, conflicts increased, vanity and ambition began to grow. The text describes that what the watchers brought was not just information, but also an acceleration of the corruption of the human world. And as if that weren't enough, from this union between the watchers and human women, something was born that would completely change the destiny of Earth. The Book of Enoch describes that from these forbidden relationships, gigantic beings called Nephilim emerged. These giants grew quickly and possessed strength far greater than that of ordinary men. In the beginning, they depended on resources produced by humans, but as they grew, the situation began to become increasingly difficult. The giants began to consume enormous amounts of food, animals, and resources. And when these resources began to lack, the narrative states that they began to act in an even more brutal way. Earth began to descend into a period of great violence and destruction. The text describes that the presence of the Nephilim brought fear to humanity. Entire peoples had no way of resisting the strength of these giants. The natural order of the world began to break down, and violence began to spread everywhere. And it is exactly at this point that the Book of Enoch begins to show that what the Watchers initiated was about to generate far greater consequences than they imagined. Because according to the story, the suffering caused by this whole situation began to rise to the heavens. The narrative states that the earth itself began to cry out for justice in the face of everything that was happening. Violence, chaos, and corruption reached such a level that something needed to happen to restore the balance of creation. But before we move forward to the moment when judgment begins to form, I want to know something from you. Have you ever heard that the Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, Mount Hermon, and the emergence of the Nephilim in such detailed way? Comment below something simple like Watchers, Enoch, or even rebellious angels if this type of story surprises you. I also want to know your opinion. Do you think these stories represent real events described in ancient texts? Or do you believe they are symbols created to explain evil in the world? If you've made it this far at the end of the video, it shows that you really enjoy exploring ancient mysteries, deep biblical stories, and intriguing revelations, like those in the Book of Enoch. And few people stay until the end when the subject involves such complex topics as rebellious angels, watchers, and the fate of fallen angels. So if you've made it this far, let me ask you something quick. First, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos where we will continue exploring biblical mysteries, ancient texts, and stories that almost no one explains in detail. Every week there is new content exactly in this style. Now I want to do a test with those who actually watched until the end. Go here in the comments and write the sentence, "I reached the end," to discover the fate of the rebel angels. This helps a lot to show the algorithm that this video is interesting, and also helps me know who really follows the full content. And of course, if this video made you think, reflect, or learn something new about the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, and the judgment of the fallen angels, leave a like here on the video. This simple gesture helps the channel to continue bringing increasingly in-depth content on these topics. And now I highly recommend that you watch the next video that is appearing on your screen. In it, we will continue exploring other mysteries and revelations that are also linked to ancient texts and little-known stories that can completely change the way many people understand these narratives. So click now on the next video that appears on the screen, because the next story could be even more surprising.